Hill. He was one of my colleagues at Reformed Theological Seminary, and he is now Professor Emeritus in New Testament and Early Christianity. He is, I don't want to embarrass him too much, but he is an expert on manuscripts. He's made major significant contributions to our understanding of the New Testament and the early formation of the canon. And he also works extensively on Revelation. I'm told that people thought that everybody in the early church was pre-mill until Chuck Hill, and he set the record straight. So it's just a great opportunity to have you here, and thank you so much. Thank you, Marcy, for coming and spend this time with us.
Thanks so much, Nick, for all those lies and exaggerations. I appreciate it very much. Well, it is wonderful to be here once again, and John reminded me, I wondered if there would be somebody here who was in a class that I taught, what was it, 20-something years ago, on the book of Revelation. And here he is, and he remembered it. He remembered that class, and John, I'm going to ask you to summarize that class in one word.
Recapitulation.
Thank you. You did it.
That was a big one.
All right. Well, let's open in prayer before we get started. Our good and gracious Heavenly Father, how thankful we are that you have given us this book among all of the books of your word. You've given us this book to live by. Thank you that you have preserved it for us. Thank you that it has ministered down through the centuries to your people and given them hope and strength for their daily lives and their lives in times of trouble and in times of plenty. We ask that your Spirit be among us today, and as this class goes on to read the book and study it, that you would open our eyes to see the wonders that you have to reveal to us, to encourage us in our walk with Christ. In his name we pray. Amen. All right, so Dr. Reed tells me that this class is going to be reading through the book of Revelation the next weeks. You probably all know that is, you will be blessed because the book of Revelation pronounces a blessing upon those who read and those who hear the words of this prophecy. I'm going to have to keep showing you the screen. I have to keep my eye on the screen or it will disappear, won't it? Yes, again, as you know, that the book of Revelation pronounces a blessing upon those who read and hear the word. And as you're going to be reading it out loud, it's nice to remember that that is how the first addressees experienced it. So you read the first verses of Revelation. Come to verse 3. Blessed is he who reads aloud the words of the prophecy, and blessed are those who hear and who keep what is written therein, for the time is near. So often, we probably don't think about this. The books of the New Testament, books of the Old Testament were written to be read out loud to the faithful. And in Colossians, Paul mentions this. When this letter is read out to you, make sure it's read in Laodicea, and make sure you read the letter to Laodicea. But Revelation, more than any other book, makes a point of the reading, the reading and the hearing of this. Even think of that refrain in the 7 letters. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit is saying to the churches. So, as you read it aloud, think about that. Think about the what impression this is supposed to make on you in the hearing of it. So you might try to pick up on repeated words or repeated ideas. And I think that we're meant to listen for those things. And of course, the effect will be enhanced if Dr. Reed chooses to read it to you in Greek. But even if he doesn't, in English, you'll still get some of that sense, I think. All right, and as we begin, we have a lot, that we can talk about just to introduce the book, point out some things for you to listen for and look for. But as we get started, would anybody want to give voice to some of the difficulties that you have in the book of Revelation? That might help me out today to know what things to avoid, what things to talk about. Things that are particularly difficult for you as you read the book of Revelation. Maybe you have a hard time centering in on anything. But like, is it the symbolism?
Yeah.
Is it? Okay.
I always think it starts out fairly, well, like other scriptures. It makes sense to me, and it goes forward, and also it changes into a prophesying, and then it becomes more difficult.
Okay.
That makes sense. At the beginning, it's
It's pretty understandable.
Yes, and then it seems to veer away.
And then it veers away. Right. It starts out kind of sounding like a letter, and then you have the 7 letters, and you at least know what a letter is, even though there's a lot of symbolism in the letters. But yeah, then when you get past that, you have beasts, you have dragons, you have this Babylon, you have red horses and white horses, and all kinds of things. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about the symbolism. Talk a little bit about the symbolism today. We can only go so far, but I wanted to, one of the first things I wanted to say, besides that, one of my favorite woodcuts, anybody identify that? Recognize that? Anybody from art class?
Is that Albrecht Dürer?
Who said Dürer? Yes, very good. Albrecht Dürer.
Art history.
Art history comes in handy. All right, it's the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. 3 of them are pretty easy to see. 1, 2, 3, and there's 4. I think that's death and Hades. All right, well, we mentioned that how Revelation was meant to be read aloud and heard. Now, I don't know if everybody can see that, but I'll make sure and repeat what's up here. So listen and look for repeated words and patterns. I think that Revelation is a key to the Christian life and the Christian view of the world. A key, maybe you've never thought about that, how Revelation is a key to the Christian life, understanding the Christian life and the Christian view of the world. What is Revelation about? How could you encapsulate it? We heard a one-word encapsulation, recapitulation. We'll get to that later. But if I had to encapsulate it in a few words, I think it would be something like this: that Revelation reveals to us the paradoxical present rule of Jesus Christ as King of all kings, his ultimate triumph, and the salvation of his people. So it's the paradoxical present rule or reign of Christ, Jesus Christ, his ultimate triumph, his ultimate victory, and the salvation of his people. All at once. Do we have enough chairs? There's up here.
We're fighting for seats here.
We saved those
For you.
got little prime seats in the
Front row. Front row. Right there. You got an air conditioner to sit up front.
Move back a little bit so as not to endanger the first row.
This is a great place to sit.
Okay, so does that sound odd to anybody? The paradoxical present rule. I think that's probably the most popular view out there today is that Revelation is mostly about the future, right? There are some interpreters who say it's about the past, If you look at all the range of interpretations and the commentaries and so forth, some say it's almost all fulfilled already. Either in the 1st and 2nd century, all fulfilled, or even some say by 70 AD, everything is fulfilled. Anybody know what that view is called? Preterism. Preterism, it can cover a number of different views, but preterism is a view that Revelation and almost everything in the New Testament is in the past. All the eschatological teaching has already been fulfilled. More typically, what you hear in the popular view is that Revelation is about the future. Okay, well it certainly is about the future. It certainly is. There's no doubt about that. But it's not only about the future. Sometimes you can get the impression that Revelation really, the real readers, or the real subjects of the book are only those who will be alive in the last 7 years of history, after the rapture takes place and so forth. If that were the case, then how is it useful for the rest of us, who lived before that? How are we to experience that blessing that's pronounced on those who read aloud and hear the words of this prophecy, right? So I think that there are many, many places in the New Testament, or in Revelation, I hope you will listen for these as you read it through, that tell us that Revelation is mostly about our present, the present age. I would say the present age as Christ is ruling on his throne. You can almost say a summary of Revelation is in the last couple articles of the Christological part of the Apostles' Creed. That is, he is seated at the right hand of God the Father Almighty, and from there he will come to judge the living and the dead. He is seated at the right hand of God the Father Almighty. This is about his session, his heavenly session, what's going on now. Now, there's a little bit before that, there's a little bit, at the end, he will come back to judge the living and the dead, but I think that's a very large part of the book of Revelation. And why do I say that it's essential to the Christian life, to our view of the Christian life and the view of the world? Because Revelation is so important for that, because I think more than any other book in the New Testament, and the Gospel of John is probably number 2, Revelation reveals to us the paradox of this life. The paradox. That is that Christ is reigning right now, even though we experience trouble here below. And you get this all the way through. I'll just look at a few verses here. Chapter 1, verse 9, right in the first chapter. Somebody want to read that out loud while I take a drink? Somebody who has that.
Was it 1:9?
1:9.
I, John, your brother and partner in the tribulation in the kingdom, and the patient endurance that are in Jesus, was on the island called Patmos on account of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus.
All right, did you notice the paradox right there? I, John, your brother, who share with you in Jesus the tribulation and the kingdom and the patient endurance. How do tribulation and kingdom go together? The popular imagination, says that if Jesus were reigning now, if he is, what about all this evil in the world? What about all this suffering in the world, particularly among God's people? Kingdom doesn't go along with tribulation, but here it does, right in the same sentence. John says, I share with you the tribulation and the kingdom and the patient endurance. Remember what Jesus said in the Gospels, he who endures to the end will be saved. How can we be having to endure? How can we be suffering and undergoing tribulation while Christ is reigning on the throne? Right, that's the paradox. It's the paradox of the book of Revelation. And I would suggest that's the paradox of your life, Christian life. Our life now between the first coming and the second coming of Christ. Some of you have heard it described maybe as the already not yet. That's another way of talking about this paradox. And the book of Revelation, I think, gives us this clearest, starkest, yes, it's symbolic, it's not always easy to understand, but it's very memorable and vivid depiction of what the Christian life is like now between Christ's first coming and his second coming. I think that this paradox comes to, well, I think it has its peak, you might say, a key moment at least, is in chapter 12. Chapter 12 is where, you have the woman with the male child, and he's caught up to heaven, and then Michael and the archangels fight with the dragon. The dragon's thrown down. All right, that's the first part of it. And I'll start reading at verse 9. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now pay attention to what the loud voice is saying, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down, who accuses them night and day before our God. And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they love not their lives even unto death. Rejoice then, O heaven, and you that dwell therein. But woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows that his time is short. So I would suggest to you that there's the paradox. Salvation has come. The kingdom of God and the authority of Christ have come. The devil's been thrown down out of heaven. So rejoice, heaven, and all that dwell therein. But woe to you, O earth and sea. How can that be? Wait a minute. Aren't we supposed to be shouting for joy as well? Woe to you, O earth and sea. How can the salvation have come? How can the kingdom of God have come? And we have woes here on earth. Well, that's the paradox. That's the paradox of Christ's victory on the cross, yet he has not come back the second time to judge the living and the dead. His victory is won, and all that we see now, all that we experience, is part of his reign. And I think that gives us the perspective on the Christian life. We overcome. How? How do we overcome? How do we emerge victorious from this strife? What does the text say?
By the blood of the Lamb.
By the blood of the Lamb. Right. Christ has won that. And it says one more thing. And the word of our testimony. And the word of their testimony. Because they what? Love not their lives even unto death. And I think that's it. When you die in the Lord, and you are dying as a confessing Christian, you have not denied the Lord. You win. And Christ wins. That's, I think, the power, showing the power of Christ's resurrection, his present reign in heaven. I always tell students that I think some of the best commentary on the book of Revelation is found in some of the early martyr accounts of the church. There's one called the Letter of Vienna, Leon, comes from the late 2nd century, in which they talk about the persecution they were experiencing. This is a place in Gaul, modern France. The persecution they were experiencing as the work of the devil. I mean, they were point blank, they were very upfront about it. This is the work of the devil. And they said that what he wanted to do, the devil wanted to wring some blasphemy out of us. If you think about it, that's what the devil wants to do. He wants you to blaspheme Christ. He wants you to deny Christ. Well, that was the point of all confess the faith in the emperor, denounce Christ, and he will let you go. That you can live in this world. But when you don't deny Christ, when you endure suffering, when you endure trial, and you endure faithfully to the end, you are saved and you are conquerors. So I think that's the book of Revelation presents that more vividly, more starkly than anywhere else in the New Testament. Now, let's see. I wanted to talk some about the structure of the book because I think that anytime you can get a read on the structure of a book, that always helps you to understand it, helps you to break it down into easier chunks and see like kind of where the author wanted us to pause and so forth. So this is a little bit touchy because I'm going to give you my approach to that. If you open any other commentary, you'll get a different approach. So take it for what it's worth. But even if you don't buy it completely, I think looking at it the way I'm suggesting will help your how to organize it in your mind. Okay, because I think you can look at Revelation as very simply a prologue and an epilogue with four visions, four major visions, and their aftermaths. I'll talk about that in a moment. Four major visions. So I thought, aren't there a lot of visions in Revelation? Yeah, you could say that. Every time John says, and I saw, and I saw, and I saw, he says that many times, you could say that's a vision. But there are four major places in Revelation that I think set themselves apart, and I think are intentionally that way, and that help us to organize what we have in the book of Revelation. So let me see. What do I have here and what you have on your handout? I just want to introduce these four major visions. Let's see, I think on the back of your handout. Somebody missing a handout?
Yeah, if we could have a few over here. The latecomers. We're all cursed if no hands.
Yeah, I don't want to.
You got yours. See, the rest of us, you got the front seats too. What's something wrong here? Any others? Any others? Yes, fine. All right. Okay. Here we go. More.
More? I'll take one too. I'll have it. All right, so on the back, I've listed these. If you just look at the top, each. So as I said, there's a prologue, you might say, up until just about where we were reading earlier, 1:9. 1:9, I think, starts one of these visions. Each vision has these four common elements, and this is why I think that they stand out. There's an inaugurator of the vision. That is, in this case, it's either Christ himself, the risen Christ himself, or one of his angels in the last two. The inaugurator of the vision. Someone comes to John and introduces the vision. So John's not just dreaming on his own. There's always someone there to initiate this. There's a mention of John being in the Spirit. The first one is pretty well known. He says, I was in the Spirit when? On the Lord's Day. On the Lord's Day. That's the only place where he says that. But other places he's said to be in the Spirit. In all four of these places. And then a third element, there's a verbal introduction to the content of the vision. And if you look at we'll go through these in a moment. And then the last element I find kind of curious, but it's in all of these, is a mention of John or others instinctively falling down to worship. Now, you might remember John gets kind of in trouble the last couple of these because he falls down to worship, and what happens?
Rebuked.
He's rebuked, right, because it was an angel revealing and not Christ himself. But he's so overwhelmed, he falls down to worship, okay? So, but it's kind of curious. You have some reference in all these to someone falling down in worship. It may not be right in the beginning, could be later on. So each of these visions, let me just go through these very quickly. The first vision is the vision, I would say it's the vision of the Son of Man, or the victorious Son of Man. That's in chapter 1. It's the one we just read introduced by the voice of the risen Christ. John's in the Spirit on the Lord's day on the island of Patmos, and he's told, write what you see in a book and send it to the 7 churches. Write what you see, what is and what is to take place hereafter. So there's some indication of the contents, what he's going to hear or see. And then John falls down at Christ's feet as though dead. That covers the first vision of chapter 1, and I would say that with each of these visions, there's what you might call an aftermath. If you think of some of the Old Testament visions or prophecies, sometimes the prophet will see a vision, and then there's an interpreting angel or some interpretation event that goes along with that. Is that right, Nick? Just say it. Yeah, okay. Some kind of interpretation of that vision. And it's kind of like the same thing going on here. There's a vision, and then there's an aftermath of that vision. And I would say the 7 letters are the aftermath of this first vision of Christ as the risen Son of Man in terms of Daniel 7. So that one I think is fairly easy to see because all of the letters refer back in some way to that vision. The second one, starts, it's the Lamb takes up his heavenly reign, and that's in chapter 4. I'll just turn there quickly and look at that. Chapter 4, after this I looked, and lo, in heaven an open door, and the first voice which I've heard speaking to me, and that was Christ's voice, like a trumpet, said, come up hither, and I will show you what must take place after this. So I will show you. This is the content of the vision. I'll show what must take place after this. And once I was in the Spirit. So again, this mention of being in the Spirit. And lo, a throne stood in heaven, and so forth. And at a certain point in this vision, everyone, heaven and earth and under the earth, falls down in worship. Okay. So that's the second major vision. And that one, I think, introduces the longest section of the book, all the way, you look at your outline, all the way to chapter 16, verse 21. So the aftermath of this vision, I would say, is the major part of the book. All right? So, and it talks about Christ's reign. And you have the 7 seals and the 7 trumpets in this one. The third vision comes in chapter 17. And I'll just turn to there quickly. Then one of the 7 angels who had 7 bowls came and said to me, come. So here's another introduction. This time it's one of the angels. Come and I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who's seated upon many waters. So that's the content of the vision. Show you the judgment of the harlot with whom the kings of the world have committed fornication, etc. And then verse 3, and he carried me away in the Spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman. All right, so he's in the Spirit again, and then towards the end he falls down and worships and gets rebuked for it. The last one is the vision of this descent of the bride. That starts in chapter 21, verse 9, which says, then came one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls, the last plagues, and spoke to me, saying, come, there's that invitation again, come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. And in the Spirit he carried me away to a great high mountain, and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem. Now you can see that particularly with these last 2, there are strong parallels. You see any parallels in these last 2 visions? As to the content. What's that?
7 bowls.
Yeah, it was one of the 7 bowl angels. 7 angels that had the bowls who showed the vision to him. Any other similarity or contrast? Easy contrast, you might say.
Contrast 2 women.
Exactly. The content of the vision has to do with 2 women, a woman in each one. The first woman is the prostitute, Babylon. The second woman is
The church.
is the bride, right. And these two women are also two cities. Babylon and New Jerusalem, right. And of course, we know that there are also people, right? Not just cities, but the people of God and the people who are not of God. So these last two visions are very parallel to each other. One is kind of the opposite of the other. Okay. Any questions at this point about either the structure or the main intent of Revelation? Hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for discussion at the end, but I want to make sure anybody gets an opportunity to say something.
I was just wondering about the difference between the carried away in the spirit into the wilderness and carried away in the spirit to a great high mountain.
That's right. That's
Those are
another
very
contrast.
different places there.
Yeah.
Big
Yes.
contrast.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I think that's intended to be a contrast as well. Taken away in the first vision to a wilderness, and taken away in the second one to a great high mountain. Okay. All right. Well, again, to my mind, excuse me. Not only does I think this is intended, these four major visions and their aftermaths, and I think it also helps us to get a handle on the book of Revelation, organize it a bit, rather than just being a steady stream of symbolism and so forth. You see that there are these four main visions. Each one has a vision proper and then an aftermath to it. Actually, the last one does not have an aftermath section. So it goes right into, you might say, the epilogue. Okay, let's move on then to let's say something. Oh, here before major visions. There, I forgot what I had up here. If some of you are interested in chiasms, raise your hand.
We don't even know what they are. What it is. Define.
But you don't know what you need to know what the chiasm is. Just say you're interested in. I think you might say there's a chiasm. So some commentators will talk about how the book of Revelation is organized, and it's a series of sevens. There are 7 sevens or something like that, or there's a chiasm arrangement where the first and the last element correspond, and the second and the last correspond, and there's sort of an inverted parallelism. We won't really go into that right now, but let's talk about the symbols. The thing that some of you said is, well, really the most challenging thing about Revelation, and it certainly is challenging. I tell this often. This reminds me when we were having family devotions with our kids, and our youngest was, I don't know, he was probably 7 years old, maybe something like that. We were dutifully reading through the New Testament, got to the book of Revelation, and we got to chapter 12 of the book of Revelation, and that's where John says, "And a great portent appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was with child, and she cried out in her pangs of birth in anguish for delivery. And another portent appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon, with 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 diadems upon his heads. His tail swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven, and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to bear a child, and that he might devour her child when she brought it forth." And our little 7-year-old said, "Finally, part of the Bible I can understand." We all said, "Tell us more." What do you understand? All right. So, dragons, okay, 7 heads and all that. Well, I actually think that he was onto something, because this is one part of Revelation and its symbolism that at least some of it is pretty easy to understand. Okay, just give me your. No, there's no grading here, no grading. So wrong answers are accepted. But what do you think is going on there? What's being depicted in those verses? A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, 12 stars, and she's with child. She's about to give birth, but there's a dragon waiting for her to give birth, and to devour the child. But the child is born and then taken up to heaven.
Birth of Jesus.
Mary and Herod.
Mary and Christ.
Okay. We're all see how easy that is. It has something to do with the birth of Christ, right? Something to do with it. Christ is the child, and we know that he is caught up to heaven. That's the end, the beginning, and the end of the story, right? Of Christ's earthly ministry. So that's pretty easy. And then the woman, okay, Mary maybe first comes to mind, but anything else?
Israel.
Okay, Israel. Why?
The stars.
Well, the 12 stars. And isn't Israel often depicted as a woman?
Yes.
As is the church. We already talked about the bride of Christ, right? So I would say that's a complex symbol. The woman is a complex symbol. It's not just one thing, but you get the main drift, okay? And I think that's one of the symbols that is fairly easy for us. And remember, there are some symbols in the book of Revelation that are already interpreted for us. Right? Can anybody think of what those are? There are only a few.
The churches in the first few chapters.
Right. The churches, and we know that they are, and right in chapter 1 in the vision itself. Remember, Jesus is holding 7 stars in his hand, and there are 7 lampstands. Do you remember what those are? He interprets those for us.
Lampstand pastor.
Yeah, the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. Okay, so that's helpful. There are a few things like that. There's another one. The bright linen worn by the bride in chapter 19 and that fine linen is, anybody remember that?
The
righteous deeds of the saints. Right. Okay. So there are a few like that, and there are a few that are fairly easy. Okay, I'll give you a couple of others. The Lamb. Who is the Lamb? Christ is the Lamb. Right. Who is the Son of Man? Christ is the Son of Man. Who is the dragon?
Devil.
Okay, the devil, Satan. Okay. So you see, you're on your way. We're all on our way. Now we just have to do Babylon first, second, all that
And the
stuff.
Soviets.
Yeah, the Soviets, the Chinese. I've heard the Chinese during here. But I'll let Dr. Reed explain that.
Would you take the 2 witnesses? How would you take the 2 witnesses?
Okay, very very briefly, the 2 witnesses I think are another symbol for the church. Yeah, there's a lot of speculation, a lot of different views about the 2 witnesses. Yeah, I think that's another symbol for the church. If you think of the church, where 2 or more are gathered into my name, Jesus sends out his disciples 2 by 2 to evangelize. There are a number of reasons why I think that by the testimony of 2 or more witnesses that I mentioned that will be established.
Jesus transfiguration, when he was transfigured, the 2.
There were the 2 prophets with Jesus.
Yeah, that was in God.
What's that? That's right. There's Moses, and who is the other one? Elijah. Moses and Elijah. So are they literally Moses and Elijah, or are they Moses and Elijah symbolic of the church? There are all those questions. So we could just go down the line and talk about each of the symbols. Maybe we'll do that in the question. I don't know how much time we exactly have.
We end on the hour.
On the hour.
Around 10.
All right. Let's come back to that maybe in the Q&A. There are a few things I wanted to say about the symbolism in general in Revelation. One hint, I think, is given to us right at the beginning in the very first verse that says, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show to his servants what must soon take place, and he made it known by sending his angel to his servant John. That last verb, that is, made it known, he made it known by sending his angel. It's actually a word, it's actually the word for signify. He signified it. It's not the word show, he signified it. And it's the word for sign, put in a verbal form. He signed it, you might say. He put it in, I think you could almost translate it, he put it into symbolic form. That would be an overtranslation, but not by too far. The verb is sometimes used that way. In other words, what I think this is hinting to us is that these symbols, these images, are given to us as they were given to John. As they were given. Now, what do I mean by that? I think that often in the popular imagination, we conceive of prophecy, and even John's prophecy, and this is a popular view, as, let's say John is transported in time, right? He's transported in time, and he's witnessing future events. And these future events are happening in front of him, and he has no way to describe that except in symbolism. Let's say he has, and maybe some of you have heard this, he sees, chapter 9 tells us about locusts, a great locust plague. They rise from down below. And these could be nuclear helicopters because they have all these strange things, you know, the hair like a woman's hair, and maybe that's like the helicopter. They've got teeth, and it's just, and they have stingers on the back end and so forth. So what could these be but like modern warfare weaponry, right? So John has never seen this before. So how does he describe it to us? Well, it was like a locust. It was like a locust with heads in its tail and so forth. Right, that's one way of viewing it. John is transported in the future. He sees literal history. He describes it in symbolic forms. I don't think that's what we should think. In other words, Revelation says that Christ signified it to his angel. It comes to John in symbolic form. In other words, what he describes is what he sees. He says he saw a lamb as though slain. He saw a lamb as though slain. Now that lamb stands for something. We know that lamb stands for Christ, but it's not as though he saw Jesus standing in front of him, looking like Jesus did when he was on earth, with the wounds. I think he saw a lamb. When he says he saw a woman sitting on a beast with 7 heads, I think he saw a woman sitting on a beast with 7 heads. Now, we still have to interpret what that means, but it doesn't mean that he looked ahead to see some, and that city is really Washington, D.C., or Moscow, or some city, and the woman is the culture or something, and the 7 heads are. It's not that he's putting it in symbolic form. It's there already. So I think that's one thing that can help us. We can kind of eliminate that one idea that John is transported into the future, sees literal events, and then tries to symbolize those. I think that also helps because it shows us how universal this symbolism is and how it always applies to God's people. Because the symbol, let's say Babylon. Let's say Babylon meant something obviously in John's day. Let's say it has something to do with Rome and the Roman culture. The Roman culture has passed out of history, the Roman culture of his day. But Babylon has not passed out of existence. Babylon remains with us. It's what was it about that Roman culture in John's day that remains for us always an enemy of God's people? The same thing you could say about the beast and the false prophet, I think. They may have had a particular meaning in John's day, but that particular meaning didn't exhaust the meaning. The symbol remains, I think as long as the book of Revelation remains, that remains a valid symbol for God's people. We have to figure out, again, what it means. But it's always there. It doesn't pass away with that, with John's experience of it. And it's not just reserved for the very last day. It's not just reserved for the last 7 years of history, let's say. Okay, any comments or questions on that
Sure.
symbolism? Yeah.
Sure. To what extent do you think we're sort of making errors in our culture when we're trying to interpret? We're looking forward rather than looking back to the Old Testament. Locust and Joel, for example.
Yeah.
The Lamb, obviously connected to Passover, and Babylon and Zechariah. So all of this imagery really is looking back in many ways to tell us about our current state and the future. Or would you push back on that? And
No, I think that's, did I have that? Just hit how much of the, listen for the Revelation's prolific use of Old Testament imagery. So many of the symbols, as Dr. E just said, are either come directly from or have some rooting in the Old Testament. And it's both its history and its symbolism. So yeah, I would definitely say that even the image of Babylon, right? Babylon itself, Babylon in John's actual day, late first century, was Babylon really a power? No. What is Babylon? Almost everybody associates it in some way with Rome, right? That was the Babylon of John's day. But Babylon itself goes back to the Old Testament, and particularly passages in Jeremiah 51, and there are many others. But there are close parallels if you go read through Jeremiah 51 and 52, and then before you read Revelation, when it talks about Babylon, you'll see a lot of parallels. You'll see how that's the background. And that's right. The better we understand our Old Testament, the better we'll understand Revelation. I've heard this story. I haven't checked it out, but maybe some of you have heard of Moses Stewart. He was a 19th century biblical commentator. He wrote a commentary on Revelation, and he took 7 years before he started that commentary. It took 7 years of study of the Old Testament before he would write his commentary on Revelation, just so he could try to understand the Old Testament background, the imagery. So Revelation is very interesting in that respect. It never quotes the Old Testament. It never quotes the Old Testament. But it's full of symbols, full of allusions, and picking up on all kinds of symbols. Let's just name a few. We've mentioned Babylon. What else comes to mind?
the accuser of the serpent, obviously Zechariah 3, Genesis 3.
Right, the serpent itself, the dragon / serpent, the ancient serpent he's called once, goes right back to Genesis, the very beginning, Zechariah, and elsewhere. It's where the Lamb and Babylon, and the Son of Man from Daniel. Right, very important, particularly for the first vision in chapter 1, the Son of Man vision. It's very meaningful too, because just very quickly, if you think of the gist of that vision in Daniel 7, it's the one like a son of man appearing before the Ancient of Days, and he, what? Receives the kingdom. Christ appears as the risen Son of Man in glory. He's received the kingdom. I mean, I think that the connection there is pretty clear.
What about the abomination that causes desolation? It's not specifically mentioned in Revelation. Is that an Old Testament image that you would say is carried into Revelation?
The abomination itself, abomination that makes desolate. I'm not. I have to think about that in particular. There's certainly the 3.5 years. So that abomination of desolation is in the passage, Daniel 9, that has to do with the 3.5 years. Is that right, Nick?
Yes.
And the 3.5 years, thank you. Yeah, the anointed one is cut off in the midst of the week, the last 7 years. And that leaves you 3.5 and 3.5, cut off in the midst, right? So I think actually, and Emeritus Klein used to teach this, that the 3.5 years of the book of Revelation is that last 3.5 years of Daniel 9. The Messiah, the anointed one, is cut off in the midst of the week. But we never learn about the rest of that week. And I think that's in the book of Revelation. So, and it's symbolic. It's a symbolic number. But yeah, our time is running short. But I think that's connected to that passage. Yes. We're at just about the end of what I wanted to talk about, and then we can talk any more about questions. Oh, well, there's a lady. I don't want to embarrass anybody, but the last thing I wanted to say something about was the idea of recapitulation. John has just been waiting to talk about recapitulation. Anybody want to say what recapitulation is?
You told us a long time ago, you taught a class on Revelation, it was really helpful, and that was a really good concept. You taught us it's like the same story told from different perspectives rather than getting stuck in a strictly chronological order like this. You tell the same story from different viewpoints. Exactly.
That's it. Some would call it cycles and so forth, but the idea of recapitulation, and I like to point out that this was first noted in the 3rd century by one of the earliest commentators on the book of Revelation, Victorinus of Petau. And he wrote, well, I'll just summarize it, that he said we can't look for the order, the chronological order in the book of Revelation, because the Holy Spirit, when he's traversed around to the last of the end times, he returns to the same thing again. In other words, the long and short of it is, I think we see several different presentations of the last day, the last judgment, presented from different angles, different emphases. So what that means, I would say the first one comes at the end of chapter 6. The end of chapter 6, this is after the 6th seal. The 6th seal is opened on the scroll, and there was a great earthquake, verse 12. The sun became black, moon became like blood, stars of the sky fall to the earth. The sky vanishes like a scroll that's rolled up. Every mountain, island removed. Kings of the earth, great men, generals, etc. They're all hiding in caves and hiding from God, saying, "Fall on us and hide us from the face of him who is seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath is come, and who can stand before it?" That sounds for all the world like that. That is a depiction of the last day, the last judgment, the coming of Christ. Okay, if the last judgment comes in chapter 6, what is the rest of the book of Revelation about? Well, it starts over. It goes back and back and back. And as John said, one of the main takeaways from that is that you can't, or we shouldn't try to read Revelation in strictly chronological fashion. So if you attune yourself to listen to these descriptions of the last day, these descriptions of the judgment day, then you're expecting that after that, things will start over again. We'll get a new picture. In other words, what we get are these several pictures of the world as it is now, the world under the reign of Christ. They all kind of end with the last day, with different ways of depicting that. That's recapitulation. And that's one reason why all millennialists, when they get to chapter 20 of Revelation, they don't see that as a future millennium on earth. Because chapter 19 gives us another picture of the Last Judgment. Chapter 20 doesn't happen after the Last Judgment. It takes us back to as an overview of the whole period. But that's just a teaser for Dr. Reed to explain. We have a few minutes.
I feel that to complement John in Revelation is Martin Luther King's letters when he was in prison in Vienna at this time. If we read those, I think they're so important that we need to focus on that more too, because I think there's a lot of great information in that man. And I really liked it when I was a young person growing up in that era, but I learned to like it more, and I took a class where I got the letters, and I kept them for some reason. And I refer back to those, and I find new information. But what a compliment this man in the 60s gave to John, who was also in prison, and symbolic, although I think John had to write it according to the people receiving the information, to get out of that prison that information to the people. Symbolic, I guess that's how we learned it, because these people would understand it.
Yeah.
If they didn't, they'd crush his words. Thank goodness Martin Luther King's letters were not crushed.
Yeah.
Such a
Well, that's a good recommendation. And it ties into what I was saying before, that some of the early martyr literature from the early church also gives us insight into Revelation and what it meant to those people as they were going through persecution.
Yes.
So, and I think we probably see this throughout history when in periods of persecution. It is often when the church draws deeply from the book of Revelation. So that's really interesting. Yeah.
By the way, there's a real good book on that by Peter Lelbach, where he takes those letters and kind of sets them in their historical context so you understand what Martin Luther King is talking about. It's really an excellent book. I was just going to mention on the whole thing of recapitulation, just because the reason I remember that is when you taught that, I'd never read, of course, the book of Revelation that way. And over the years since then, reading that way has really caused the book to come alive. Previous to that, you almost think it's irrelevant. Like, how am I ever going to understand this? But when you start to understand it that way, you start to understand the final judgment is such a rich thing that it has to be explained from several different vantage points. Mm-hmm. So anyway, that has really helped me through the years to read and understand and benefit from.
Good. Yes, it's really helped me too. Yeah, that's a real eye-opener, particularly given the way Revelation is usually explained today. Yes. Yes.
I was wondering how you would approach John's seeming idolatry in the different aspects. Because it seems like he's just sort of like, oh, don't do this. This is a very serious violation of God's law that he does.
That he's falling down and worshiping.
Yeah. I don't know if you've thought about that much. I just wondering how we should think about this, or is it like maybe he's so caught up and confused in the events that are taking place around him?
I think that is maybe the best, psychological explanation of what happened to John. He's overcome. If you think of the visions that people experience throughout Revelation, throughout the whole Scripture, Moses. Think of Peter in the boat with the great catch of fish, and he said, "I'm not worthy."
Isaiah 6.
Isaiah 6.
R.C. Sproul's.
Uh-huh.
Right. None of them worship the messenger, correct?
Well, what's that?
But none of them worship the messenger that brings.
Yeah, I think this maybe explains his reaction, simply as a reaction. And maybe it's there to show us the overwhelming divine nature of the revelation. And that's all. John is not, he's not apostatizing or anything like that. It's like Peter, you might say, denying but being restored at the worst, I think. It's not even clear in one of those. He says, I fell down to worship at his feet. Is he worshiping the angel? It's not clear, but
he's only rebuked one time.
Yeah. Yeah, but it also, if you look at it with these other four, with all four of the major visions that I mentioned, every time somebody falls down in worship. So in one sense, it's meant for us to show us again that this is a divine vision, and it's overwhelming to the ones who receive it. So, yeah. Good question. Anything else? We are at time, aren't we? Well, thank you very much, and
Thank you.
thanks for your attention.
Thank you.
In God's very sweet providence, I'm preaching this morning and I'm preaching from Revelation 1. Remarkable. So this is prime the pump very much.